Thank you, Farah. I would like first to recognize Farah and all the staff of the World Affairs Council. We don't have a permanent venue, so we're always looking for places that we can host events when our speakers are available, so that's probably one of our biggest challenges. But anyway, please join me in thanking her and the whole staff that we have here making it happen. I did notice they don't serve fish here, but that's probably a good reason for that. I don't know. So this is the second time we've had Nick Kristof here. He was here in 2009 when he and his wife did their last book, which was wonderful. Greatly appreciated your being here again, Nick. I think you came the month after you published that, so we were pleased. Nick Kristof, of course, has written 2 columns a week at the New York Times since 2001, I believe. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. I'm sorry, I didn't put that right. So far, he's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And I think that's because of his typical New York Times background. He grew up on a sheep farm in Yamhill, Oregon. You all know where Yamhill is, right? You go Beavers on the west coast, Beaverton's on the east of Portland, and then you've got, Cherry Grove in the north and Wheatland in the south. Draw those 2 lines, they dissect you in Yamhill. We've got a very, I know you all knew that, I just wanted to remind you because our group is very well, we know geography here, Nick, don't worry. After high school, he worked in France. He began backpacking around the world. He went to Africa in great extent. He went to Asia in great extent, writing articles, who would have guessed, to cover his expenses. He did little things like learn Arabic while he's in Cairo, learn Chinese while he's in Taipei, which has served him well in his marriage and family and in his business. After that, he went to Harvard, where he was Phi Beta Kappa. He studied law at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and graduated with first-class honors. He's lived on 4 of the continents, reported on 6 of the continents, and we're waiting for the articles about Antarctica, so anytime, right? He's traveled to all 50 states, more than 140 countries, every province in China, every main island in Japan, and at least twice he's visited each of the countries that comprise the dreaded Axis of Evil. But it is not true that he was part of Maz Jobrani's Axis of Evil comedy tour. That's a false rumor. We shouldn't attribute that to him. On his travels, he has survived being in an airplane that crashed in Africa, battling malaria, and running away from more than 1 mob. In 1984 is the first time he actually joined the New York Times. He's been there ever since. Initially, he covered economics, he covered presidential elections, and he was a correspondent in Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. And he then became the associate managing editor of the New York Times, which made him responsible in part for the Sunday edition, or I think it made you responsible for the Sunday edition in part to all the other duties you had. In 1990, Nick and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn, who was also a journalist at the New York Times at that time, won their first Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Tiananmen Square democracy movement. And at that time, they were also the first married couple to ever win a Pulitzer Prize for journalism. He's a real person who's a leader. He's a real thought leader and an action leader in many ways, particularly electronic social media trendsetter. He was the first blogger on the New York Times website. He tweets, he twitters, he rocks and rolls. He has a Facebook fan page. He has his own channel on YouTube. But he's also one of the earliest on a number of issues of great import. He was one of the earliest opponents of the war in Iraq. He was among the first to warn that we were losing ground to the Taliban in Afghanistan, and also one of the first to identify that there was non-existence of weapons of mass destruction, reporting first that the claim in the President's State of the Union address about Iraq seeking uranium from Africa was not only inaccurate, but was in fact contradicted by the administration's own investigation. In his column, as we know, he often focuses on global health, on poverty, and on gender issues, particularly in the developing world. Since 2004, he's written dozens of columns about Darfur. He's visited that area at least 10 times. And he won his 2nd Pulitzer Prize for his graphic columns, which were produced at great personal risk to him, which focused attention on genocide in Darfur and gave voice to the voiceless, not only there, but in other places around the world. He's won awards too numerous to list: the George Polk Award, the Overseas Press Club Award, the Michael Kelly Award, the Online News Association Award, the American Society of Newspapers Editors Award. You get the point. He's also been the feature of a HBO special called Reporter, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2009. I watched that recently because I realized I hadn't seen it, and it's great. You should see Nick in the field. You see him in the Congo and the challenges not only of learning what he learns, but dealing with the issues that he has there. Nick and his wife Cheryl are co-authors of many books, including China Wakes, The Struggle for the Soul of a Rising Power, Thunder from the East, Portrait of a Rising Asia, Half the Sky, From Oppression to Opportunity for Women Worldwide, a book I highly recommend to you, and A Path to Peers, Transforming Lives, Creating Opportunity, which each of you should have a copy of now. Nick and his wife are the parents of 2 boys and a girl, is that right? Okay. Who delight in correcting Nick's Chinese as well as his Japanese. And on rare occasions, when he can, he still enjoys backpacking, and he still enjoys running, although he prefers not to run from mobs. Please join me in welcoming Nick Kristof.
Thanks a lot, Alan. Yeah. Great introduction.
Lots of chord.
Okay. Thanks so much, Alan. I am impressed by your geography of Yamhill, Oregon. Boy. I'm also, I'm going to actually wander around a little bit because I can sort of barely see folks in that corner. But I'm also impressed by how many students are here and also by the location. I've been in a lot of places, but I don't think I've ever spoken in an aquarium. And feels a little fishy, but it. Now, there's Cheryl, my co-author and wife, and she sends her best. We still have one child at home, and so she'd love to be here, but if she did come with me, then our house would be the scene of the wildest party you can imagine. So it seemed most prudent to divide our efforts. Now, people are often kind of curious about how it is that a New York Times reporter should be writing a book about kind of how to change the world, how to make a difference. And in a sense, it really arose because Cheryl and I were trying to see how, what we could do to engineer a little greater purpose, and also because we wanted to see what we could do to inculcate in our 3 kids, a greater empathy, a greater interest in the world. And one thing we have done for years is we tended to drag them along on our reporting trips to expose them to deprivation, to remind them how lucky they are. Given the places we go, that is sometimes tended to be a little bit awkward. I almost lost my daughter in Iran once, which would have been a hard call home. Honey. And I remember one time when my daughter was in maybe the 8th grade or so, I took her along on a reporting trip. I was in Honduras writing about gang-controlled slums, and we'd just gotten through one really hairy gang-controlled checkpoint. And I was trying to, reassure her, and I said, Caroline, don't worry, in just a couple of days, we'll be in rural Nicaragua. And she turned to me as, only a teenager can and said, Dad, when my friends go on vacation, they go to the Caribbean. And actually, Cheryl and I decided that she had a point. So our next family vacation, we took all 3 kids over Thanksgiving to the Caribbean. We had a great vacation in Haiti during the cholera outbreak. So you do what you can, But one of the reasons we also became interested in this topic of sort of making a difference, changing the world abroad and at home, is that it seems to us there's kind of a revolution underway in philanthropy. There's been a huge amount of innovation in the last 10 or 20 years. A lot of borrowing from the business community, a greater emphasis on metrics, on using business and for-profit models to make a difference, and inevitably they're more sustainable than nonprofit models. And indeed, in our household, we've played with some of these. I want to tell you about the best Father's Day present I ever got, and I commend it to those of you who are thinking about Father's Day present next year. In fact, what I'm going to do is just show you what my Father's Day present looked like. Isn't that the coolest Father's Day present? This is a giant Gambian pouched rat. It is 3 feet long, nose to tail. This is the most macho He-Man rat you can imagine. And I released a few here so you can just take a look at them as they go by. What they do is they have very weak eyesight, but an excellent sense of smell. And so I didn't actually take possession of my rat. It was trained in my name to detect landmines. And I went to Angola earlier this year to see how my rat was doing. Here's my rat detecting landmines in Angola. And traditionally, landmine detection was using a human with a metal detector in front of you, and it's incredibly tedious and slow affair because the metal detector picks up not just mines, but it picks up every bit of scrap metal that is there. And often, typically where there are mines, there are also AK-47 shells, there are nails, there are bits of everything. And so every foot or every few inches, you're finding something, and then you're carefully, painstakingly scraping away the soil to see what it is. Well, the rats, they don't respond to the metal, they respond to the scent of explosive. And so a human deminer can clear about 20 square meters a day of a minefield. My rat can clear 250 square meters a day. And my rat works for bananas. So, that's a reflection of this sort of burst of innovation, and in a lot of ways that we're seeing, sort of taking new approaches to old problems. But I think another part of this revolution in philanthropy, and not just in philanthropy, also in government efforts to bring about change, is much greater emphasis on evidence. It used to be that change making was basically about hunches that we had. And in the last 15 years or so, there's been a huge emphasis on testing interventions at home or abroad as if they were pharmaceutical trials, and seeing how effective they are against control groups and at what cost. And we're learning all kinds of things when you do this that are sometimes not intuitive. There was a lot of excitement some years ago, as I'm sure a lot of you know, about microfinance as an engine of change. When it was carefully studied using randomized controlled trials, it turned out that micro-lending, which is most often what microfinance is, that micro-lending was helpful and beneficial, but maybe less so than we had hoped. That it was helpful but not transformational. In contrast, another element of microfinance that is less focused on, micro savings, helping people save small amounts of money, really was transformational, but for women, but less so for men, for reasons that are still a little bit unclear. And those are the kind of things we wouldn't be fully aware of if we didn't carefully test them. If you read my work, you know that I'm a huge believer in education as a lever for change, as a way to not just empower individuals, but empower societies. And we normally think that the way you get more people in school in the developing world is you build more schools. And indeed, that's one thing we definitely need to do. But there's another way of getting more kids in school in poor countries that is far less expensive. Anybody who hasn't read A Path Appears, any guesses about what that might be? Clean water might well do that. It wasn't tested in this rubric by these economists. No, shoes I would think might also be cost effective, but again they weren't tested in that way, and I don't think they'd be quite as effective. What I'm thinking about is a pharmaceutical. It's a pharmaceutical that would be found in many of your homes, but that none of you or almost none of you have ever taken. How's that for a riddle? Any guesses about what it might be? It's a pharmaceutical. Iodine is actually, again, a great guess. And iodine has been shown to keep kids in school longer. The problem is that in many developing countries, the salt is not iodized. And fetuses, especially in the first trimester of pregnancy, need iodine from their mother's body. And if they don't get that, then the brain doesn't develop as well as it should, especially for female fetuses, which for reasons that, again, are somewhat unclear. But the result is that areas that were randomly assigned to get either iodized salt or iodine capsules for women of reproductive age, that a dozen or 15 years later, the girls born in those areas stay in school longer and do better in school than other areas. But so iodizing salt is very, very cheap, about 5 cents per person per year. So that may well be a competitor too, but it wasn't tested by the same metrics. The pharmaceutical I'm thinking of is, if it's in your homes, it's not for human use. There's a pretty good hint. Deworming. I think somebody said that. Worms, deworming. We don't think about that because our kids don't have intestinal parasites. In much of the world they do. I mean, actually the Rockefeller Foundation dewormed American kids 100 years ago in the South, and it had this dramatic effect on the ability of American kids to study, to stay in school. If you have parasites, then the nutrition isn't going to you, it's going to the worms. And you're also much more likely to be anemic and listless and harder to focus on your schoolwork. You miss school. And deworming is incredibly cheap and easy. This is what the metrics look like, and this is a Kenya study. And I don't know if everybody can see it back there. I'll give you eye strain. So if you try to get kids in school in Kenya through bricks and mortar, it costs about $350 per marginal student brought into the school system. If you do it by deworming, it's $3.50. So it's an amazing difference. And that's the kind of thing that is emerging through a greater emphasis on evidence, on trials. And likewise in this country, we're learning much more about what works, what doesn't work. One of the interventions in this country that would be enormously effective, and that would in fact be so effective it would save public money many times over, has to do with the fact that in the US right now, American girls, 30% of American girls will become pregnant by age 19. As far as we can tell, American kids and European kids have sex at very similar rates based on surveys, but American kids get pregnant and have babies 3 times as often. Why is that? That's because we have less good comprehensive sex education in the US, and kids in this country don't have as good access to reliable forms of birth control. 70% of teen pregnancies are unplanned. And these figures, the 30% figure, is even after a substantial reduction in teen pregnancy rates since 1991. And yet it's still off the charts in the industrialized world. And some careful randomized control trials, one in St. Louis, Missouri, a similar trial in Colorado, have found that if you help at-risk girls who don't want to get pregnant, if you help them avoid pregnancy, then you save a huge amount of public money, partly because a long-acting reversible contraceptive is about $500. One Medicaid childbirth is $14,000. And yet we don't invest in the former, we do invest in the latter. Every dollar invested in family planning for at-risk kids saves about $6 later on. And we're learning a lot more about these kind of interventions and what works, what doesn't work. One of the lessons is about the importance of intervening early in life, whether we're talking about abroad or at home, that it's so much easier, more cost-effective to focus on 6-month-old kids or 6-year-old kids rather than 16-year-old kids who are already in trouble. There's a lot of discussion about inequality and where that takes one, and I think that it's useful to remember that while the metrics of inequality that we use are usually about wealth or income, maybe the greatest inequality of all is about opportunity. And I think that's also arguably one where there's greater chance of getting political traction. In the US, inequality tends to be sort of a liberal word and often implies inequality of outcomes. Inequality at the starting point, inequality of opportunity, is an issue that really does engage liberals and conservatives alike. I saw a quite amazing study showing that in the US, 97% of Americans agreed that there should be broader, more equal equality of opportunity. And 97%, I mean, that's 97% of Americans don't agree that the world is round. So the idea that one can, achieve some agreement on And so what would greater equality of opportunity mean? And it really does mean focusing early in life, where the brain is developing. The first 3 years, the first 5 years. This is a child I met named Johnny, who left a deep impression on me in West Virginia. He can't speak. Well, why can't he speak? He had ear infections that weren't addressed, and so he became completely deaf in one ear, partially deaf in the other ear. He didn't get a hearing screening, something as simple as a hearing screening. So finally, Save the Children, the group Save the Children, gave him a hearing screening and found the hearing problem, and once people were aware of it, they quite quickly were able to address it and resolve it. But the problem was that for several years, as his brain was developing, he wasn't getting any auditory stimulus. And so it's not clear that he will ever fully recover, fully be able to speak, because the ball was dropped when he was in the first few years of life. Something as simple, low-hanging fruit as a hearing screening. And likewise, there's a lot of evidence that coaching at-risk low-income families in talking more to children, reading more to children, things like this, have powerful incomes in getting people more ready for school later on. And when all this comes together, then, again, whether it's at home or abroad, it's really kind of inspiring what you can see. And I want to show you a little video, and this is video is a little bit dubious. We'll have to see whether it works. But if it does work, this is of a school in kind of an amazing school in Kenya, in the Kibera slum in Nairobi. It was started by a young man, Kenyan, who grew up in this slum, got no formal education, and then applied to Wesleyan University. He had no SAT, no transcripts, but Wesleyan took him because they recognized he's a brilliant, incredibly charismatic kid. He graduated as their commencement speaker, went back and started the Kibera School for Girls, a girls' school there, beginning with early childhood interventions. And this is a girl called Eunice at that school who wrote a poem. And let's see if we can make this work.
Unisacot presents my dream. Welcome. I have a dream.
Can you hear that?
Never fail. Every magic king was once a crime baby. Every great tree was once a tiny seed. And so is my dream. This journey seems so long, yet I will not waver. The path has stones all over, but I will not give up. Every day of my life is a page of my history. Every step that I take is a move to my glorious destiny. It's not where I am, but where I'm going that matters. Now listen. Listen carefully to the words of wisdom. Stop watching your dreams go down the drain. Fight, faith, fearlessly, like a wounded lion. For it's not about who you are, but how you see yourself. So dream. Thank you.
Isn't she amazing? Eunice is truly an extraordinary girl, and it is sort of a reminder of what can happen. To me, one of the great aphorisms of the 21st century is that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And so many people underscore that at home or abroad. I sometimes wonder why, given the evidence about what works, what doesn't work, why we don't more often pursue those things that are evidence-based and that would even save us money. And I sometimes wonder if one of the reasons doesn't have to do with what might be called an empathy gap. What do I mean by an empathy gap? One way of looking at it is that in the US right now, the 20% of poorest Americans actually donate significantly more to charity than the 20% most affluent Americans. Now, why would that be? I mean, affluent Americans aren't intrinsically any less empathetic or compassionate or good than anybody else. But it seems to be that if you are affluent in America today, then to some degree you're insulated from need. You live in a nice neighborhood, most of your friends are reasonably well off, so you're intellectually aware of need, but it's not something that you encounter all the time. In contrast, if you were poor in America today, then every day you encounter people who are needier than yourself, and so you respond. And indeed, affluent Americans who live in economically diverse neighborhoods are substantially more generous than those who live in completely affluent areas. And I think there's also some risk that if one is insulated in that way, then one comes up with narratives in which disadvantage, whether abroad or at home, is simply about personal irresponsibility. And my take is that this is a real issue, and that there is no doubt that people do compound poverty with irresponsible behavior. That's real. But it's also clear we're getting a much more sophisticated understanding of how that happens. And one of the lessons is that when people feel a certain hopelessness, then at that point, they engage in self-destructive behaviors that make that hopelessness come true. And there's some fascinating work just in the last few years. It's sort of an emerging area where giving people a sense of hope. Sometimes it's simply, in Ethiopia, one study just involved randomly assigning some folks to a pep talk. Meant that they ended up saving more money, engaging in less self-destructive behavior, and doing better. In other words, that maybe a lot of the interventions that we think about and see work not so much because of the nature of that intervention as such, but by giving people hope that then becomes self-fulfilling. And I guess I would also say that while I think the conversation about personal responsibility is a perfectly legitimate one to have, we also have to think that as long as we're talking about that, when we have interventions that can not only improve people's outcomes but save us money doing so, then the failure to do so is a certain measure of social responsibility for society as a whole. And if we can chip away at that empathy gap, then it's kind of remarkable what can sometimes happen. One of the stories we tell in A Path Appears is about a kid growing up in the late 1950s in rural Arkansas. His name is Ollie Neal, African-American kid going to a segregated black school. Really smart kid, but also kind of a troublemaker. He works for a local store, gets fired for shoplifting. He reduces the sainted librarian at his school, Mrs. Grady, to tears. And then one day he's skipping English class, and he's in this little school library that Mrs. Grady had set up. And he's not a book reader. He's a tough kid. Tough kids don't read books. But a book catches his eye. He explains later, Ollie tells me, that it catches his eye actually because the cover shows this woman with this very risque top. I've always sort of wondered about that because this is 1957, and what does a risque top even mean in 1957 terms? But whatever it means, it catches his eye, and so he looks at it, and so he thinks for a moment he'd kind of like to look through it, but then he looks over the checkout counter, and there's a girl in his class, and he's embarrassed to be seen checking out a book. So Ollie just puts the book in his jacket and walks out. He steals the book. Well, he reads it at home, and it's a great read. It's the first novel he's really read and enjoyed. So he returns it after a week or two, puts it back on the shelf, and then it's by an African-American author named Frank Yerby, so he notices another Frank Yerby novel. So he steals that one. He takes it home, and again, it's a great read. He really enjoys it. He eventually returns it. He notices a third Frank Yerby novel he hadn't seen before, so he steals that. This happens a fourth time as well. And it really turns him into a reader. He then goes on to read other novels. He graduates to more literary fiction, to current events. And from this third-rate, segregated black school in rural Arkansas, he goes on to college. From college, he goes on to law school. He becomes one of Arkansas's first African-American lawyers, a leader in the civil rights movement, later a prosecutor and a judge. This is Judge Ollie Neal. And throughout his career, he's very much devoted to helping disadvantaged kids like the one that he had once been. And he's also kind of a hero in this school community. So he goes to all the reunions. At one reunion, he sits down with Mrs. Grady and he says, "Mrs. Grady, you know, it's your little school that completely turned my life around." Mrs. Grady says, "Well, Ollie, I have a," and he also says, "But Mrs. Grady, I have a confession to make that, I stole a bunch of your books." And Mrs. Grady says, "Well, Ollie, I have a confession too. I saw you steal that first book." And she says that she'd been really indignant at him. What is this jerk of a kid doing now, stealing books on top of everything else? And she was about ready to go and confront him and yell at him. And then, in this flash of empathy, she understood that he was embarrassed to be seen reading books. And so even though he is this obnoxious kid who had made her cry, she lets him steal the book. And that weekend, she drives 70 miles to Memphis to a used bookstore to find other Frank Yerby books. The first bookstore she has didn't have any. She goes to another. The second didn't have any. She can't remember if it's the third or the fourth that had one. She buys it with her own dime, goes back, puts it on the shelf, and when Ollie Neal steals that second Frank Yerby novel, she is thrilled. And then she drives back to Memphis and does it all over again. And it's sort of, anybody who has engaged in these efforts know that helping people is a lot harder than it looks. And that's true whether you're doing that in Houston or whether you're doing it in Nairobi. But anybody, you take a risk on somebody, you try something, and sometimes you just get your heart broken. But anybody who has tried also knows that every now and then, often unpredictably, you can take a risk on somebody, maybe even somebody who doesn't really fully seem to deserve it, and you will have this remarkable impact, as in Mrs. Grady and Ollie, not only on that person, but to ripple through them into the lives of others as well. And I think that's what comes if one is willing to try to leap over that empathy gap. One of the lessons to me also where we haven't harnessed our resources as well as we should in trying to bring about a difference has to do with our response to terrorism, to violence, to conflict since 9/11. And as a reporter who spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Syria and Yemen and a lot of other such places since 9/11, it's striking that we have overwhelmingly relied on the military toolbox, which has its uses, is important, often has no substitutes. But we have under-relied on the education toolbox and the women's empowerment toolbox. And none of these are perfect, but they all can have an impact. And you look at Pakistan and Bangladesh, both part of the same country until 1971. Then Bangladesh invested heavily in education, girls' education in particular. Bangladesh has plenty of problems today, but it's not someplace we worry about as a terror risk to the U.S. Yemen and Oman, in the 1960s, Oman was more backward than Yemen. Then it focused on educating its kids, and Oman is now this nice, boring country we never think of. And that's kind of what we should be aspiring to, nice, boring countries that we don't worry about. And the trade-offs are kind of remarkable too. For the cost of deploying one U.S. soldier abroad for 1 year, we can start about 20 schools and fund them for 3 years. So we definitely need that military toolbox, but I think we've underused that education toolbox. Girls' education tends to be particularly powerful partly because of the demographic impact. One of the factors that correlates most strongly to violence and terrorism in a society is the youth bulge in the population. How do you reduce the youth bulge? Well, if you educate a boy, on balance he'll have fewer children, but it's a somewhat marginal effect. You educate a girl, she'll have dramatically fewer children. So if you want to reduce that youth bulge in 10 or 15 years, you educate girls today. And it's so, this is something that terror groups understand intuitively. You look at the Afghan Taliban throwing acid in the faces of girls who were going to school, the Pakistan Taliban shooting Malala in the head, Boko Haram kidnapping schoolgirls. They understand that the greatest threat to a terror group isn't a drone overhead, it's a girl with a school book. And yet I don't think we fully absorbed that lesson ourselves, even though this is something that is relatively cheap to do and is a great complement to that military toolbox. I want to leave you with a thought. There's one question I often hear, sort of a skeptical question about what good one can do in a world where the challenges are so huge. So, education to me is one of the great issues of the day. There are still 59 million school kids around the world who should be in elementary school who aren't. 59 million. That's not a problem that any of us in the room are going to be able to resolve, that the US can resolve. It's huge. But so we may be able to quite easily help one or two girls go to school. We're not going to resolve the problem for 59 million. In that sense, sort of anything we do ends up feeling a little like a drop in the bucket. But I'm kind of a believer in drops in the bucket, partly because of this person. This is Vladislav Kristofovich. He's a World War II refugee. And he fled Ukraine and Romania, eventually made his way to France. He could not get a work permit in France. He was cleaning hotel rooms, and he thought that France would never be fully accepting of an East European refugee, either of him or of his yet unborn children. So he resolved to go to the US. As it happened, one of the hotel rooms he was cleaning belonged to a young American woman who was there for the Marshall Plan. She liked him. She convinced her parents in Portland, Oregon to sponsor his way to come to the US. This didn't resolve the global refugee problem, didn't make a dent in the refugee problem, but it was completely transformative for Vladislav Kristofovich, who was kind of that proverbial drop in the bucket. When he came to the US, he decided the name Kristofovich was completely unworkable. It had 3 Z's. And so he shortened it to Kristof. That's my dad. And so if you want to understand why drops in the bucket actually can be transformative, take it from me, drops in the bucket. That is truly how you fill buckets. Thank you very much, and be delighted to take questions.
So we have the cards at your table. If you haven't seen those yet, we do have some from some of our students. So let me start with those. Mr. Kristof, in your article, Refugees Who Could Be Us, you said that the U.S. has only accepted around 1,500 Syrian refugees since the war began. What's the reason for the U.S. to not accept more refugees, Syrian refugees? What do you think we should do? I think there's you only have to, this evening in the Republican debate, I'm sure we'll hear plenty of people who think we are taking in too many foreigners, and I think that is compounded in the case of Syrian refugees by fears that there are going to be terrorists brought in. Absolutely there are security risks. We may bring in some troublemakers, and we'll also bring in some brilliant kids who will truly enrich this country. I think that I'm glad that President Obama raised the number to 10,000. I think we could certainly go much higher, but I must say that that is not going to be a solution to this problem. And I
admire Angela Merkel's generosity of spirit toward refugees in Germany, but that too is not a solution, and indeed there is some risk that word spreads through refugee camps that now we've just got to set out for Germany, and some risk that there will be more people boarding rickety boats and more kids like Alan Kurdi, that child who drowned. So it's complicated. It seems to me that the paramount lesson and where we need to put our focus is in trying to make Syria habitable again, so you don't have this exodus of refugees. And for those 4 million Syrian refugees who are in the surrounding countries, making life decent for them, acceptable for them, so that they likewise don't have to flee. 220,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan just got their food rations cut to zero. The Syrian refugees in Lebanon just got their food ration cut to $17 a month. 53% of Syrian refugee children aren't able to go to school in those surrounding countries. Well, of course, if you're a loving parent and you can't afford food for your children, you can't send them to school, then of course you're going to set out on a dangerous journey to Europe. And fixing the problem in Syria right now is hard. I have my ideas, and maybe they would work, maybe they wouldn't, but it's very uncertain. But improving conditions for those 4 million Syrian refugees in surrounding countries, that is something that is doable. And it is a kind of a disgrace that the international community hasn't, over the last 4 years, made conditions habitable for them where they are so that they have to leave.
Thank you. So again, one of our students is interested to know what you feel about the Iran deal, where you see Iran playing a role in the world stage over the coming years.
Well, I'm glad that I was able to recover my daughter on the last Iran trip, or otherwise I might be a little constrained in my answer. I mean, I think the Iran deal was flawed, had problems, but all international agreements do. They invariably involve concessions. Maybe the most problematic part of the Iran deal is that after 15 years, Iran will be, to some degree, back to where it is now, with a much shorter breakout time than what it has in the middle period. But I don't see any reasonable alternative to it. We have a situation right now where Iran's breakout time is unacceptably short, and the critics of the deal sometimes say, well, we need to try harder sanctions. They'll agree to tougher concessions. The sanctions are going to disappear in any case. Europe and other countries are, they think the time for sanctions is over. We can't unilaterally keep those sanctions in place. So that is just not an option. And this deal seems to me infinitely better than any of the alternatives available to us. So I totally agree that it's flawed. I think it's far better than any of the alternatives.
So you've spoken about empathy. So how do individuals in society and how do societies move from empathy to action? How or where can someone start to make a change in the world?
If you look in the back of A Path Appears, there are a bunch of just great organizations doing interesting things. And I counsel you, don't try to solve every problem in the world, but find some issue that you care about. And maybe it's water, or maybe it's maternal health, or maybe it's education. But find that one issue that speaks to you, whether maybe it's abroad, maybe it's at home, and focus on that. And find an organization that speaks to you, and get engaged in it. I think there's this theory out there, one sometimes hears from students, that the first 1/3 of one's life should be spent studying, the middle third making money, and the final third giving back. I think that's a terrible idea. I think if you do that, you rob yourself for 2/3 of your life of one of the great pleasures and rewards of being human, which is to find a cause larger than yourself, and to benefit from those psychic rewards as part of it.
So what about companies, corporations around the world? What should they be doing? What do you think they can do to help make the world a better place?
I'm fascinated by corporate social responsibility, CSR, and I think this has huge potential if companies have real scale, if companies adopt an effort, whether it's on the environment, on human rights, on how they source products, that can have an impact far beyond what a small nonprofit can do, and it's sustainable because it's part of the business model. But while it has this huge potential, I think companies hugely underperform in CSR right now. And I think right now it's typically window dressing. It's typically shunted aside. If you're appointed head of CSR in your company, that's a pretty good sign that your career advancement track is over. Unfortunately, I hope there's no vice president for CSR here. Oops.
I raised my hand just to give you a hard time.
Okay. But I think that is probably going to change, because I think for young people, when they look for a company to join, they care about these things. Brand management matters a lot. You look at companies for whom brands are incredibly important: Apple, Google. It seems to me that, right now their CSR, Facebook, likewise, their CSR is pretty lousy. I think that to compete, to get new employees, to compete as brands, they will have to do a better job of that. And I think that will be a really powerful force for bringing about change more broadly.
In your article after the TV reporters were shot, you made a lot of great points about gun control and society and guns. Could you reiterate or summarize some of those for us?
Yeah, look, as a farm boy from Oregon, I grew up with guns, and I think that one thing is pretty clear, that this is going to be a country awash with guns for years to come. We're not going to ban guns, we're not going to eliminate them, and so the question becomes, how do we manage a society with a lot of guns and try to reduce the toll? And the toll is kind of astonishing. So every year we have more than 30,000 gun deaths total. Many of those are suicides, some homicides, and a smaller number of accidents. Since 1968, we've had more Americans die from guns at home than have died in all the wars in America's history going back to the Revolutionary War. It's kind of remarkable. And I think that the model of periodically I hear from people who say, well, look at cars. We also have more than 30,000 auto deaths a year, and we don't ban them. No, but cars are the perfect model, because we don't ban them, but we regulate them to reduce the death toll. If you look at the auto fatality rate in 1921, the fatality rate for 100 million miles driven, we've reduced the auto fatality rate by more than 95% since then. And it wasn't one thing or 5 things or 10 things. It was a million things. It was padded dashboards. It was seat belts. It was airbags. It was these graduated licenses for young drivers. It was better designed roads. It was gathering data so we understand what would save lives and what wouldn't. And in the same way, this public health approach, I think, to gun safety is not going to make gun deaths go away, but if we can reduce the toll every year by 1/3, which seems to me a plausible target, that would be 10,000 lives saved a year. And so I think this sort of public health approach to making a country with a lot of guns somewhat safer for everybody is the approach we should be pursuing.
So we have several questions, I think mostly from our students, but probably from other members as well, about what can younger men and women do to prepare themselves to be lifelong advocates, both home and abroad, for good social change, and what are some of the common mistakes they make?
My big advice for those who are young, or for the parents, if your kids will actually listen to you, what to encourage them with, is to get them out of their comfort zone, to expose them to different worlds, and for me, that really happened when I took a year and was studying Arabic in Egypt. And this was a difficult time. I mean, there are a lot of students who study abroad in flocks in Rome or London, and that's great, but I would really encourage you to go someplace off the beaten trail, out of your comfort zone. And my time in Egypt proved to be really kind of a difficult time, partly because of my name. I know Faraz speaks Arabic. You'll understand this. I'll never forget my first Arabic conversation. Somebody said to me, "Ismak," which I recognized meant, "What is your name?" So I was so proud of myself. I'm about to have my first conversation in Arabic. So I say, "Ismi," my name is. And I think Nicholas Kristof is way too complicated. So I just say, "Ismi Nick." Well, this person looks at me in horror, backs off sort of tremulously, and asks again, "Ismak?" I knew something had gone wrong, but sort of following the general theory that anybody can understand English if it's spoken loudly enough, I just beamed and stepped toward him and repeated, "It's me, Nick," and he ran away. And how was I to know that Nick is, how do I put this? It's the F word in Arabic. And actually, to make matters a little worse, it's the conjugation. It's like the familiar. It's like the to form. So you're not only being vulgar, you're being condescending. And to be precise, it's a familiar imperative. And so friends would see me across the market and yell, "Hey, Nick!" We'd start a riot. And so with this baggage of my name, it was really a difficult year. In a sense, that is what I wish on those of you who are students, to be out of your comfort zone and bewildered and wondering what is going on, because that's when you're learning, that's when you're growing and building new muscles. And I should say that you can do that in Egypt, or you can do that in India or Bangladesh or China. You can also do that in Houston, in a different kind of neighborhood. You can tutor in a prison. You can tutor disadvantaged kids. You can encounter those different worlds much closer to home as well. But I hope that at some point you will find a way of getting that kind of experience about different worlds when you are in over your head, and that will shape you as it shaped me.
So one of our members would be very interested to know your assessment of the millennial goals and their relevance today, and which ones.
So when the UN adopted the Millennium Development Goals, I was sort of a skeptic. I thought, they're complicated, there are too many to remember, and in fact, in retrospect, I think they worked pretty well. They were not fully met. For the most part, they weren't met, but there was tremendous progress that was registered. So in education, for example, as I said, there are still 59 million primary school age kids who were not in primary school. It was supposed to get down to 0. On the other hand, there were more than 100 million kids who were out of school 15 years ago. And so there's been real improvement. I think it was a way of holding countries accountable, giving them something to aim at. What I think the suggestion for kind of down the road is that we always need to remember that we address what gets measured. And so in education, for example, the metric was the number of kids enrolled in school. Really, the more important thing is whether kids are learning anything in school. And there are so many kids who are technically enrolled in developing countries who are learning nothing at all, truly 0. There's one school book for every 10 kids. There's 200 kids in the class. The language of instruction is often a language that they don't speak. And so they attend school for 4 years, 5 years, and they have learned zip. And so I think we need to be more sensitive to the metrics we use and recognizing that these can be real powerful tools to hold countries accountable for the progress of their people.
Okay, well, we always promise we'll let everybody out by 1:30, so we have a few minutes. So I'll ask 2 last questions. I want to say these are all great questions. And I'm sure even the ones I can't read are great questions, so I apologize if I didn't ask your question. Maybe my eyes and your handwriting combined, and the light up here also. But let me just ask too, because we actually have a couple people asking about the Pope and the Pope's visit to the U.S. What would, maybe to characterize those collectively, what would you hope to see the Pope focusing on and saying to the people here, and what difference do you think that'll make?
I mean, boy, I've been so impressed by the Pope and his, he has this, basically his power is the power of the podium. And he's in the lighting business, trying to shine a light on neglected issues, getting people to think about them. And I think that's what he has done astonishingly well. And I hope that, when he's here, and evidence is that he will, remind us of inequities in our own country, the moral imperative to address them. My own take is that the Pope is not as good an economist as he is a humanitarian. I don't buy the notion that trade is fundamentally kind of problematic, and I do, as anybody who lived in communist countries will attest, that really turns one into great believers in markets, while acknowledging that markets also have their problems. But I think that he has been so powerful in shining a light on kind of where we fall short and holding societies accountable for that. And I'm just struck by when he speaks at Congress, he's then going to rush out and have lunch not with congressional leaders, but I believe it's with the homeless in Washington. That is just so cool.
Nick, look, as a last question, what would you like each of us, not just our students, but each of us to be thinking about every day that would help this process? I think your and Cheryl's book will help us with some of that, but what would you like us to keep in the forefront of our mind when we're being mindful?
One of the issues that is in the back of my mind has to do with how humanitarian needs are covered or not covered in the media. And I think that the media, unfortunately, often, especially television, often drops the ball on these issues, whether we're talking about inequity at home or abroad. And so, you look at a quarter of African American inner city kids in the US grow up with lead poisoning in ways that will rob them for the rest of their lives of cognitive capacity. And this is something that is just never covered. And if it's not covered, it's not going to be addressed. Abroad, you look at South Sudan, which is edging toward famine and mass atrocities. And likewise, it's pretty much not covered. When that's not covered, it's not going to be addressed. And I fear that if we in the news media have done sometimes a lousy job addressing these kinds of issues in the last 15 years, we're going to do an even worse job in the next 15 years. We don't clearly have a business model that pays for this kind of coverage. We're struggling to evolve one. That makes everybody tremendously concerned with cutting costs and with finding audiences. The Gates Foundation, a few years ago, essentially bribed ABC News to cover development issues. It wasn't called a bribe, it was called a grant. But you get the point. They gave a grant to ABC News to cover global health and nutrition issues. And this was controversial within the development community, because why should Bill and Melinda Gates be devoting money not to vaccinating kids or health interventions, but rather to be paying television executives to be doing their job anyway? And so it's controversial, but then in fact ABC News did some terrific coverage on maternal mortality, on micronutrients, and this raised the profile of these issues and got them more traction. It's regarded as a great success. And so then the Gates Foundation went back to ABC News and said, okay, we'd like to renew the grant. And ABC News said, no, we don't want to accept your money, because we can see from our metrics that when we air these important stories, that's when viewers switch the channel. I find that so depressing. And I think that fundamentally that is why these issues are not going to get addressed as much in the coming years. But I would say to you that you all have your own spotlights in your own way, and maybe it's it's your book club or your Facebook page or your Twitter handle or your dinner table conversations or your church group or whatever it may be. And as we drop the ball in the coming years, I hope that you will use your spotlight in some form to keep these issues illuminated on the public mind, because if we don't do that, they just won't get addressed.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Come on.
Great to be here.